Hi everyone, I am Marloes Peters and I work as a chemical engineer at Newcastle University. So we have, via the Royal Society of Chemistry, we have an outreach fund on microorganisms and what they do for you. So we talked about the bad bacteria in a previous video, and here we're going to talk about some that are good for you. So we're going to talk about the trillions of bacteria that we have in our gut, but also how they're used to make or to produce really interesting flavors, such as for instance in chocolate and in cheese. And it is good to know that we are not alone in our body. We've got, as I said before, trillions of bacteria, and they really are much more. You've got much more bacteria than you've got cells in your body. And there's no such thing as having good and bad bacteria. So I just need to clarify it's more about the balance between the two. And a lot of those bacteria we have in our gut, in our intestines. And this is so unique that it's as unique as a fingerprint. So the microbiome of bacteria that you have in your gut is different for every person. And what you have there, it will help you to fight off infections. But if there's something wrong, it can also lead to some chronic conditions or diseases. And we find more and more evidence is that there's also a link between the brain and the gut. For instance, I did my PhD on monitoring neurotransmitters, not in your brain as you might think, but in your gut. And that had some implications for people with irritable bowel syndrome. So if you want to know more about that, have a look at this recommended video. So here I'm going to talk a little bit about probiotics. And probiotics means when you take foods that contain live bacteria or yeast. And it comes from, it's part Latin, part Greek. So it comes from the Latin for and the Greek bios, which means life. So that kind of indicates that you're taking these live microorganisms. And you will have seen this a lot when it comes to yogurt. So probably when you look at some kind of Activia, when you open it, you will see, or you will see on the label that it will tell you that there are bacteria in there. So what it would aim to do is to help to restore the balance in the gut. So there's not so much scientific evidence for it just yet, but we do know that bacteria there in the gut, that they actually have a big role in digestion. So there are some reasons for why it would be good to take particular foods. And the foods we're talking about, think of, for instance, certain cheeses, think of yogurt, think of pickled vegetables, and you will also see fermented foods play a big role in this. And here I'm just going to show you some of those bacteria. Don't they look pretty if you look at them? So these microorganisms come in different sizes and shapes. So I think you probably know yeast is often used in baking, such as in bread, for instance, when you make your own pizza at home. These bacteria can be round, so in cockeye shaped, they can be rod shaped, they can have different sizes and shapes. And if you would look at probiotics, I'm going to talk about two of the common ones. And the first one is the bifidobacteria, which you will often find in food and supplements, or particularly in yogurt. So they are supposed to support your immune system and limit the growth of harmful bacteria in your gut. And these are the different species. Within those species, you've also got lots of different strains. So, for instance, these bifidobacteria is often abbreviated as B, and you will see the full name of the strain. And the second species, which are very common, again, in food or in supplements, is the Lactobacillus. So you can see they also have these particular rod-shaped, but they're slightly different size compared to the other ones that you've seen. So these are naturally present in your body, particularly in your intestines. And as the name kind of seems to suggest, they're also involved in the breakdown of lactose. Now, what they do is they have a dual role in your body. So first of all, they can control the population of bad bacteria, but also it helps as and can serve as a fuel source in your body. So there's two really important things they are involved in. And what we see that, and this was first found when they looked at breast milk, because that would contain some compounds that really promote the growth of these lactobacillus. So that's why they are quite important. Now, if we look at all of those, and then we've seen, we looked at probiotics, but they're also very important when it comes to flavor. And in a previous video, I talked about the role of caffeine in, for instance, in coffee, but how this is also related to chocolate. And if you look at theobromine, which gives chocolate that particularly bitter taste, you'll see it's actually very similar to caffeine. The only thing which is different is what I highlighted in red is this methyl group. So you see the compound seems to be somewhat related. Now, and they give it the name Microbiota, which I quite liked. And it will tell you that if you don't have any of the microorganisms, then chocolate doesn't have the nice flavor as we know it. So what happens within the beans, it tends to be highly acidic. So there's not a lot of bacteria that particularly like that. But there are some that thrive under these conditions. So what happens if you have those bacteria, in the end they start breaking down all of the acids. And that's when the environment becomes really appealing for lots of other bacteria that can take advantage of this. Now, so you have to imagine that you're within a high nutrient environment because you've got lots of sugars, you've got lots of nutrients to feed on. What then happens is that if you've got almost like an overload of sugar, imagine that you have lots of chocolate for yourself to feed on, this can lead to high activity. And when you have this high activity, you can produce certain metabolites, but because there's additional sugars, you can also produce what we call secondary metabolites. And these secondary metabolites are particularly important for giving flavor. And you can also look at secondary metabolites can also involve, for instance, production of antibiotics. So there's lots of reasons why these secondary metabolites are very important. But in the case of chocolate, they give it this really nice flavor that we're used to. Another foods why this is important is, for instance, cheese making. So if we think of how we make cheese, and I have to say, despite being Dutch, I'm not a particular fan of cheese, so sorry for that. Making cheese is really the controlled process of removing the water from milk, so you get to these really dense cheeses, such as we know it. And we do this by coagulating the protein, casein, which is present within the milk. So what you do is you separate out the whey and the solid curd, as you can see in the image, and then that solid curd is left to ripen under particular conditions. And how we treat it really influences the flavor. So this is a very controlled process by, for instance, the time, the conditions, but also the microorganisms that are involved can help to change the flavor. So usually some starter bacteria are added. So they really convert the sugars to lactic acid. So they create this acidic environment that's needed. But then as we go along, you can look at different bacteria. And as we all know for cheeses, you can also have fungi that are involved in it. And for instance, something as simple as the temperature would really help to just tailor the flavor in a very simple way. So it's a lot more complex to this, but just to show you, and you think of certain cheeses, and obviously I've shown the Dutch one, Gouda. By tailoring the temperature, you would have different bacteria that thrive because they all have their optimal conditions. So the ones that we know that have a relatively mild flavor tend to thrive at room temperature, which is what we call the mesophilic bacteria. And then if we would go to higher temperature, so to thermophilic bacteria tend to thrive. We get cheeses that have a much sharper flavor, such as, for instance, Parmesan or Gruyere. So just by tailoring something quite as simple as the temperature, you can see there would be a big difference in the flavors. And even when you look at coffee, as I've shown before, by changing the temperature, you create different flavor molecules. So the flavor of would be distinctly different. Now, what should you know from this? Well, when we think of bacteria, we think of a lot of, when you ask people, they often tend to think of the bad ones. We don't think of the health benefits that we have for us. So the balance of bacteria, particularly in our gut, is very important. And actually these bacteria help to keep us safe and to prevent us from getting infections. And they actually prevent the bad bacteria from making you sick. But what is less known, and you think of it next time when you have chocolate or cheese, they're very important for making the flavor molecules that we need for making our food actually taste good. And if you want to know more about how we can also use bacteria to produce very important proteins, such as for instance antibiotics, then I recommend that you have a look at the Introduction to Bioreactors video. Thank you for listening to this video, and in the next couple of videos for Around the Society Chemistry Outreach Funds, where we talk about microorganisms, the good, the bad and the ugly, we're going to talk more about the wonderful world of microorganisms and how important they are for us.